The air in Nexthera's towering glass fortress was thick with the hum of late-night servers, their electric pulse a heartbeat beneath the sterile floors. Then came the sound, a jagged crack of shattering glass, alien to a building designed to silence chaos. It sliced through the stillness, high above the executive suites, and for a fleeting moment, Evan Carter froze, his mop suspended mid-swipe. The city outside exhaled in pain, its neon veins flickering through the windows. The overhead lights buzzed, uncertain, as if debating whether to surrender to the dark. His breath caught, held hostage by the echo of that fracture. Then silence, until the freight elevator groaned behind him, its doors peeling open like a reluctant confession. Evan turned, expecting a stray delivery crate or a fellow janitor dragging exhaustion through the night. Instead, a figure stumbled forward. A woman, no, the woman, collapsing into the elevator's dim glow like a deer shot mid-leap. Her heels were gone, her tailored jacket torn at the shoulder, and a dark stain bloomed across her white blouse, clinging to her side like a secret too heavy to carry. Lillian Voss, Nexthera's CEO, billionaire, fugitive, her name a headline etched in his memory from glossy magazines. Her hands trembled, clutching a scarf-wrapped bundle, her eyes no longer the icy daggers from boardroom portraits, but wide, wild, haunted by something she'd outrun but not escaped. He didn't speak. Words felt like intruders in a moment so raw. Instead, he held the elevator door, its cold metal grounding him as she staggered inside, leaning against the wall as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her breaths were shallow, ragged, like someone who'd sprinted past a ghost. The doors groaned shut, sealing them in a steel cocoon. As the elevator lurched downward past the 30th floor, Lillian's knees buckled, her body folding like a paper crane under too much weight. Evan caught her elbow, steadying her before she hit the floor. "Don't," she whispered, her voice a cracked shard of itself. "Don't help me. You don't know who I am." "I know enough," Evan muttered, his voice low, steady, like gravel underfoot. "You're bleeding through a $2,000 blouse and hiding in a janitor's elevator? That narrows it down." Her gaze snapped to his, sharp and searching, then softened into something broken. A dry, jagged laugh spilling from her lips, humorless as a winter wind. "You think this is funny?" "No," he said, easing her onto an upturned cleaning bucket, its chipped plastic a throne for the fallen. "But if I don't laugh, I'll start yelling. And I've got a kid sleeping 2 miles from here, dreaming of stars, not screams." Something in his voice, a quiet, unshakable truth, made her pause. The elevator shuddered to the basement. No alarms, no guards, just the weary groan of aging concrete and the flicker of a fluorescent bulb overhead, blinking like it was deciding whether to give up. Lillian clutched the scarf-wrapped bundle tighter, her knuckles white. "You should leave me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They'll come looking. I need it out." "And this was your best bet?" Evan raised an eyebrow, his tone dry but not cruel. "The janitor's shaft? I built this place," she said, teeth gritted, her words a blade cutting through her own fear. "I know where it leaks." He didn't press, didn't need to. Instead, he nodded toward a side door, its paint peeling like old skin. "Staff exit through the alley, leads to 73rd Street. Cameras are ancient, half don't work." She didn't move, her eyes locked on his, a storm of defiance and exhaustion. "You want to carry me?" "I want you to stop being decent," she said, her voice sharp but fraying at the edges. "It's confusing." Evan shrugged, his shoulders heavy with a life that had taught him to carry more than he should. "I'm not decent, just tired, and I don't like seeing people crawl when they used to soar." Her breath hitched, a flicker of recognition or regret flashing in her eyes, buried deep beneath layers of survival. "You were in aerospace," she said, her voice steadier now, piecing together fragments of a file she'd read long ago. "Evan Carter, systems engineer, one of the whistleblowers on the Aurora Initiative, blacklisted, ended up here." The flickering bulb above was the only sound, daring to interrupt the silence that followed. Evan's jaw tightened, but his eyes didn't waver. "So you do know who I am?" I know you believed in something, Lillian said, her voice softening, almost reverent. I don't remember the last time I met someone who didn't have a price. He held her gaze for a moment, then pushed open the staff door, its hinges creaking like a warning. Come on, he said, before you pass out, and I have to explain you to my daughter. Later, in Evan's small home near the rail line, the living room glowed with the warmth of second-hand books and a dusty telescope angled toward the stars. A watercolor painting hung taped to the wall, its colors faded but defiant. The Moon from Here, signed Clara, age 6. Lillian sat on the worn couch, her fingers wrapped around a mug of tea she hadn't touched, its steam curling like a ghost she couldn't face. From the hallway came a soft voice, small but piercing. Daddy? Evan rose, his movements gentle but deliberate. Go back to bed, Bug. A girl peeked around the corner, her curls a wild halo, her two big pajamas swallowing her frame. Clara clutched a sketch pad, her wide eyes landing on Lillian, unflinching, curious. Is she bad? Lillian's breath caught, sharp and sudden. Evan stepped beside his daughter, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. No, he said, his voice a quiet anchor. She's just lost. Clara nodded, accepting the answer as only a child could. Then she held up her sketch pad, revealing a drawing, a dog soaring through a star-strewn sky, and beside it, a woman with wings, fragile but fierce. I gave her wings, Clara said softly, so she can fly away, in case she's scared. Lillian's hand trembled on the teacup, her throat tight. She blinked, searching for words that wouldn't break. What's your name? She asked finally. Clara, the girl said, shrugging. I like drawing people better than naming them. I'm hungry, Clara added, turning to her father. It's past midnight, Evan said, lifting her gently, his voice warm with a love that didn't need to shout. You'll turn into a raccoon. Lillian watched them disappear down the hall, and for the first time in hours, her chest loosened, her breath slowing. She glanced down at the bundle in her lap. The scarf had slipped during the ride, revealing a black hard drive, scratched and worn, with one word scrawled in fading marker. Veritas. The truth, etched like a vow she wasn't sure she could keep. Clara padded back into the room, holding another drawing, her small feet whispering against the floorboards. I made another one, she said, offering it shyly. It showed Lillian on a bench, flanked by a man with tired eyes and a little girl, all three gazing up at a sky bursting with stars. Clara hesitated. Do you want to keep it? Lillian's voice failed her, so she nodded, her fingers brushing the paper as if it might crumble. Clara smiled, then froze, her eyes catching something on the floor. Daddy, she said, picking up a plastic card. This was in her pocket. Evan took the badge, his fingers steady but his heart lurching. It was Lillian's Nextera Access ID, its back scrawled with bold black letters. Do not exit after board meeting. The air turned to lead. Lillian froze, her eyes locked on the card. Evan's pulse thrummed in his ears. Then from outside, the faint crunch of gravel under footsteps. Slow, deliberate, not the careless tread of a neighbor or a delivery driver. These steps knew their destination and their purpose. Evan moved, swift and silent, flicking off the hallway light with one hand while guiding Clara toward her room with the other. Lillian's grip tightened on the hard drive, her knuckles white. Stay quiet, Evan whispered, his voice low but unyielding. Back doors bolted, but the front, I know how to disappear, Lillian cut in, her voice controlled, a steel edge honed by years of survival. She slipped off her shoes, handed Evan the untouched tea, and moved toward the kitchen with the grace of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in nightmares. It wasn't fear, it was muscle memory. Evan pocketed the badge, its weight heavier than it should have been. 3 taps echoed on the front door, not a knock, but a signal, rhythmic, deliberate. Delivery, a male voice called, too calm, too polished, slicing through the night like a blade. Evan didn't answer the door. He moved to the front window, his steps deliberate, silent, and parted the curtain just enough to glimpse the night beyond. A man stood in the streetlight's pale glow, his charcoal coat absorbing the shadows. black gloves gleaming like polished obsidian. No takeout bag, no delivery clipboard, just a stillness that screamed intent. Behind him, a second figure loomed by the fence, tall and lean, his eyes scanning the roofline, as if hunting for a crack in the world's armor. Evan's heart thudded, but he backed away, his voice low and steady. "I've got Clara," he said, turning to Lillian. "You've got 30 seconds. Bathroom window out to the fence. Slide the can aside. Jump soft." Lillian hesitated, her eyes flickering with guilt, a shadow of the empire she'd built now crumbling in her hands. "I didn't mean for this to follow me," she whispered, her voice raw like a wound she couldn't close. Evan didn't flinch, his gaze unwavering. "It always does. Truth's like smoke. You think it'll vanish, but it seeps through the cracks." Their eyes locked, a silent pact forged in the weight of that moment. Then Lillian moved, disappearing down the hallway, with the grace of someone who'd learned to vanish long before she had to. A faint creak followed, the bathroom window sliding open, then the softest thud in the backyard, like a bird landing on broken wings. Evan opened Clara's bedroom door. She was curled beneath her quilt, a constellation of stuffed animals around her, her wide eyes glinting in the dark. "Are they here for her?" she whispered, her voice small but piercing. He nodded, settling beside her, his hand brushing a curl from her cheek. "Probably." "Is she bad?" Evan's chest tightened, but his voice stayed soft, steady, like a lighthouse in a storm. "She's not a villain, Bug, just someone who stopped lying. To others. To herself." Clara's whisper trembled. "That's scary." "Yeah," he said, his fingers lingering on her cheek, grounding them both. "The bravest things always are." Downstairs, the doorbell rang again, its chime longer, more insistent, cutting through the house like a warning. But the gravel outside had stopped crunching. The footsteps faded, their menace retreating into the night. The tension loosened its grip, but Evan knew it was only a pause, not an end. They were gone, for now. By sunrise, the sky was a soft steel gray, painting the world in hues of quiet defiance. Evan stood barefoot in the kitchen, his hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee, its warmth a small rebellion against the morning's chill. Lillian sat across from him, her damp curls framing her face, draped in an old flannel blanket that once belonged to Amelia, its faded plaid carrying the ghost of a life cut short. "I landed wrong," she muttered, her voice rough, as if apologizing to the dawn. "Twisted my ankle." Evan pointed to her foot, his tone dry but not unkind. "I've got ice. I'm fine." She glanced down, then back at him, her eyes a mix of offense and gratitude. "You're bleeding into my blanket." He poured her a coffee anyway, the steam curling between them like a fragile truce. For a while, neither spoke. Clara was still asleep. The house hushed except for the distant rumble of a freight train and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog, sharp against the morning stillness. Finally, Evan broke the silence, his voice low, searching. "Why'd you come here, Lillian? Of all places?" She stared into her untouched mug, her fingers tracing its chipped rim. "Because I remembered the only time someone looked me in the eye and didn't want anything in return." Evan raised a brow, his lips twitching. "That's a low bar." "Maybe," she said, her voice softening, almost breaking. "But you didn't flinch when I spoke the truth." "You didn't speak it," he said, setting his mug down with a quiet clink. "You bled it." Her lips curved into a faint, fleeting smile, fragile but real. "That's fair." He leaned forward, his eyes steady. "What's on the drive?" A pause hung heavy, then she answered, her voice low, deliberate. "Data leaks, internal memos, transaction logs, proof NextEra manipulated predictive data, sabotage competitors, skewed political funding, reassigned dissenters." Her words grew sharper, each one a blade. Reassign, disappear, buy out, frame, bury. Evan exhaled slowly, the weight of her words settling like dust in his lungs. "And you?" "I was their compass," she said, her voice cracking like thin ice, "until I realized they'd magnetize the needle." "That's poetic," he said, not mocking, just observing. She shrugged, a ghost of her old defiance flickering. "I wanted to be a writer once. My mother was." He nodded, his eyes drifting to the window, where the dawn was breaking in soft slivers. My wife was a pilot, Amelia. She wanted to teach kids to fly, said the sky was just another kind of classroom. Lillian's arms tightened around herself, her voice barely above a whisper. Is that how you ended up here? They grounded her, he said, his voice steady but heavy. Budget cuts, then lawsuits, then pills. He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. Lillian looked away, her breath catching. I'm sorry. He shook his head, his eyes returning to her. You didn't start the storm, but you're in it now. Her gaze met his, resolute, unyielding. I can't undo what I built. No, Evan said, his voice quiet but firm, but you can choose what grows in its ashes. Silence stretched between them, taut but not uncomfortable. Then Lillian reached into her coat, pulling out the scratched black hard drive, the word Veritas scrawled in fading marker. She placed it on the table, a silent challenge. I want to release it, she said, anonymously, not to the media, not the feds. Then who? She hesitated, her eyes searching his. Someone who still knows how to speak truth without being owned by it. Evan stared at the drive, then at her, his jaw tightening. Don't look at me like that. Like what? Like I'm the last clean name on your list. You're not, she said, her voice steady now, a spark of trust igniting. You're the first one I still believe in. From the hallway, Clara's voice cut through, small but bright. Daddy, the lady, did she fly yet? Lillian blinked, caught off guard. Evan smiled, pushing back from the table, his heart swelling with a love too big for words. Not yet, Bug, but I think she's almost ready. The living room smelled of warm toast and forgotten lavender, a stubborn comfort woven into the curtains Amelia had hung years ago. Morning light slipped through the blinds in slanted beams, dust motes swirling like they carried secrets of their own. Lillian stood by the window, arms crossed, wearing Evan's flannel shirt, its sleeves too long, its plaid a quiet rebellion against her past. She watched the fence line, as if the shadows themselves might betray her. She always this quiet in the morning? She asked, nodding toward the hallway. Clara? Evan poured coffee, its rich aroma filling the space. Only when she's drawing. That's when the world fades away for her. Lillian's lips curved into a half smile, wistful, almost envious. Must be nice. Evan said nothing, just handed her a steaming mug and walked past, letting the silence settle like an old friend who knew when to stay quiet. 10 minutes later, Clara appeared, her socked feet whispering against the floor, her curls a wild storm of dreams. She clutched a folded paper in both hands, holding it like it was spun from glass. I drew you again, she said to Lillian, her voice soft but sure. This time I gave you wings. Lillian blinked, her breath catching. Why? Because yesterday you looked like someone who forgot how to fly. Evan froze in the doorway, his back to them, his heart caught in the quiet truth of his daughter's words. Lillian knelt, her eyes locked on the paper, afraid it might burn her. The sketch showed her on a rooftop, arms wide, wings uneven but fierce, stretching against a sky chaotic with stars. I used to think flying meant leaving everything behind, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Clara tilted her head, her eyes bright with a wisdom too big for her years. Maybe it just means seeing everything from higher up. Evan coughed from the kitchen, loud and deliberate, breaking the moment. All right, philosopher, go grab your coat. Bus will be here in 15. As Clara skipped off, Lillian turned to him, her voice softer now. She's not like most kids. She's not like most anyone, Evan said, taking a long sip of coffee, his eyes steady over the rim. Lost her mom to a system that never apologized. Gained an artist with a telescope for a heart. He paused, then added, You know, most people who hide don't spend their first night making grilled cheese and listening to cassette tapes. Lillian shrugged, a flicker of her old defiance returning. Most people aren't hunted by those they once called Sir. The words landed heavier than either expected, a truth too raw to soften. Evan leaned back against the counter, his voice quiet but piercing. You could have kept running. I did, Lillian said, her voice a quiet confession, raw with the weight of years spent running. For 3 years, different cities, fake names, half-truths to people who deserved whole ones. But it never felt like disappearing. It was drowning in slow motion. She looked up at Evan, her eyes fierce with a longing she hadn't dared name. Now I want to breathe, even if it burns. Evan set his mug down, the soft clink of punctuation in the stillness. Then let's start small. By noon, Lillian sat cross-legged on Evan's weathered porch, sanding the splintered frame of an old bench, broken since Clara's first wobbly steps. The sun beat down, sweat beading on her brow as she worked, her hands unaccustomed to such raw, honest labor. Manual labor wasn't in the witness protection brochure, she said, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand, a wry smile tugging at her lips. Evan chuckled, leaning against the porch rail, his eyes warm with something like pride. It's therapeutic. Besides, it's not about the bench. It's about fixing something no one else bothered to. Lillian paused, her hands stilling on the sandpaper. You always talk like that, she said, her voice softer now, searching. Only when someone's listening. He met her gaze, unflinching. And you're listening. She looked down at her hands, roughened by the morning's work, marked by a life she'd spent building empires that crumbled lives. What if I break it worse? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, laced with fear and something deeper, regret. Then you learn, Evan said, his voice steady as bedrock, and try again. She held his gaze, her chest tightening. It's been a long time since I built anything that didn't ruin someone. He leaned closer, his eyes fierce with quiet conviction. Then maybe it's time to build something that saves one. That night, after Clara had drifted to sleep under her quilt of stars, the porch light hummed softly, drawing moths that danced in its flickering glow. Lillian stood alone by the radio console Evan had salvaged from a junkyard, its old brass knobs gleaming with burnished edges, built to endure rather than impress. Her fingers traced the dials as if they might whisper a path forward. Evan entered carrying 2 mugs of tea, their steam curling like promises too fragile to speak aloud. Still thinking about what to do with the drive? He asked, his voice low, cutting through the quiet. Lillian's eyes stayed on the console, her thoughts a storm she couldn't tame. I'm thinking about what happens after. He sat across from her, the porch light's hum folding into the silence, a companion to their shared uncertainty. No whistleblower hotline, she said, her voice resolute but soft. No news crews. But I want the truth out there. Quiet, clean, real. Evan nodded, his gaze steady. Do it your way, and if it backfires, it'll be your fire, not theirs. She took a sip of tea, its warmth grounding her, and glanced around the room, its walls heavy with memories not her own. You ever wonder what your life would have been, she asked, if no one had tried to rewrite your ending? Evan didn't flinch, his eyes tracing the grain of the table. No, I'm too busy writing Clara's first chapter. Her lips curved into a smile, soft but genuine. That's the kind of thing that belongs on billboards. He laughed, a low, warm sound that broke the tension. Yeah, well, I work better in small print. They sat in silence, the kind that didn't demand filling, until Lillian spoke again, her voice sudden, raw. The last time I told the truth, they called it insubordination, then delusion, then they stopped calling altogether. Evan leaned forward, his voice quiet but unyielding. They can't stop truth from breathing. They can only hold their breath. Lillian looked down, her fingers tightening around the mug, then slowly slid the hard drive across the table, its scratched surface catching the light. Veritas, it whispered, a vow etched in fading ink. I want you to be the one to say it, she said, her voice trembling with trust she hadn't offered in years. Evan stared at the drive, then at her, his jaw tight. I clean floors, Lillian. I'm not a voice. She smiled, a spark of defiance in her eyes. Exactly. That's why they won't see it coming. The scent of roasted garlic and thyme filled the air, a quiet promise woven into the chaos of the day. Lillian stood in Evan's modest kitchen, an apron dusted with flour, her sleeves rolled up as if she'd been born to this simplicity. But her eyes darted over her shoulder as if guilt might barge through the door, reminding her she was a fugitive in a borrowed life. "Should I chop these smaller?" she asked, holding up a cutting board of uneven carrots, her voice tentative, seeking something solid. Evan leaned against the doorway, watching her with a quiet awe, like a man witnessing a miracle unfold in the mundane. "You're asking the guy who burns toast if the carrots are too big?" he teased, his grin softening the edges of the moment. Lillian smirked, her hands resuming their rhythm, the knife steady despite the storm in her chest. From the living room, Clara's voice drifted through the cracked open door, bright and insistent. "I need a quiet minute." Evan raised an eyebrow. "She's writing," he said, pride lacing his words. "Something for the school showcase. A poem, I think. Won't even let me peek. She's got that fire." Lillian paused, stirring the pot absent-mindedly, the aroma grounding her. "Fire," she said softly, like she sees the world in sharper colors than the rest of us. "She gets that from her mom," Evan said, his voice heavy with something unfinished. Not grief, not anger, but a story paused mid-sentence. "Amelia." Lillian's eyes softened, her hand stilling on the spoon. "You miss her every day." He nodded, his gaze distant but resolute. "But Clara doesn't need a man drowning in memories. She needs one who builds something from them." The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through Lillian's resolve. She lowered the flame, her voice barely audible. "You're a better man than most give you credit for. And you're not the villain you think you are," he said, stepping into the kitchen, his presence steady, unyielding. She blinked, caught off guard, her heart stumbling over the truth in his words. "Don't look so surprised," he added, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You walked in here running, but you're choosing now." They sat at the dinner table, mismatched plates and a chipped candle holder glowing with what Clara insisted was real dinner light. For a moment, the world outside held its breath, leaving only the soft clink of forks and Clara's laughter over rocket-powered broccoli. Lillian caught herself laughing too, a sound so foreign it startled her. When she looked up, Evan was watching her, his eyes holding a quiet hope, like a man remembering something he hadn't dared dream in years. She looked away, the warmth too much to hold. "I brought something," Clara announced, standing with theatrical flair. From behind a stack of books, she pulled a folded paper, clearing her throat with mock gravity. "It's a poem. The Seat by the Window," Evan grinned. "Sounds like a mystery." Lillian leaned forward, her voice soft. "Or a metaphor," Clara began, her voice small but steady, each word a brushstroke on the silence. "In every house there's a seat no one dares to touch. It holds the weight of whispered things, of love that won't give up. It waits by the windowsill for stories left untold, for hands that shake but still reach out, for people growing old. Some say it's just a place to rest, but I think it's more, a seat that keeps the space between the leaving and the door." By the final line, Lillian's breath slowed, her chest tight with something she couldn't name. Evan whispered, his voice thick, "Your mom would have cried." "I know," Clara said, beaming with pride, sitting down as if she'd shifted the world just a fraction. Lillian cleared her throat, blinking back the sting in her eyes. "That was remarkable." "Did you really like it?" Clara asked, leaning in, her eyes wide with hope. Lillian reached across the table, her hand brushing Clara's lightly. "I didn't just like it, Clara. I think your poem heard me." "I wrote 23, Lillian whispered, her voice a fragile thread, as if the weight of those letters might unravel her. "That was just the last one." Evan nodded, his eyes steady, holding her confession like a stone he'd carry without complaint. "I want to help you, Lillian, not just because it's right, but because if Clara's ever caught in the machinery of this world, I need to know I fought to make it safer." Lillian's gaze dropped to the table, her fingers brushing the edge of the hard drive, its scratched surface a map of her rebellion. She stood, taking it back with a quiet resolve. No words of thanks needed. Her eyes said it all. She glanced at Clara, humming softly as she dried forks in the kitchen, her small frame a beacon of light in the dimness. Then she looked at Evan, his face etched with a quiet strength that anchored her. "You ever feel like you stepped into someone else's dream?" she asked, her voice soft, almost afraid of the answer. He smiled, a flicker of warmth breaking through his weariness. "Only when it starts to feel real." That night, long after the dishes were stacked and the candles had burned to stubs, Lillian stood alone on the back porch, Clara's poem clutched in her hands. The stars above the Aurora Initiative's distant skyline were sparse but fierce, each one a pinprick of defiance against the dark. She whispered the final stanza into the night, her voice trembling. A seat that keeps the space between the leaving and the door. The words broke on the last syllable, and in the pause a soft click echoed from the fence line, a sound that didn't belong. A flicker of light sparked in the woods, brief and gone, like a predator blinking in the shadows. Morning crept in like a hesitant guest, soft rays bleeding through the blinds, mingling with the faint scent of stale coffee and the creak of floorboards heavy with unspoken truths. Lillian sat at the kitchen table, staring at the black hard drive Evan had returned, its word veritas, a silent accusation. Her fingers hovered just above it, as if its truths might sear her with memories she wasn't ready to face. Evan stood by the sink, rinsing a mug with slow, deliberate motions, his silence louder than words. He hadn't spoken much since breakfast, as if guarding a thought too heavy to share. "I thought I'd feel better," Lillian murmured, her eyes fixed on the drive. "Handing it to someone else. Letting someone else know." Evan turned, his gaze steady, searching. "And do you?" She met his eyes, her voice raw. "I feel exposed, like the moment you speak a secret, it grows teeth." He nodded, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her, the table a bridge between their burdens. "Secrets always come with consequences," he said, his voice low, weathered by experience. "But silence isn't safety." He paused, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood. "When I worked aerospace, we had a saying, if the engine fails and you say nothing, it's your fault when the plane goes down." Lillian raised an eyebrow, a faint spark of her old defiance flickering. "You calling me the engine?" "I'm saying you're the one who knows the bolts are coming loose," he replied, his tone unyielding but kind. "Pretending you don't won't keep anyone flying." She leaned back, arms crossed, her chest tight with the weight of his words. "You don't understand. It's not just numbers and projections in there. It's names, families, politicians. If I go public, I won't just lose my name. I'll ruin others. Some didn't even know they were complicit." Evan was quiet for a moment, his eyes tracing the lines of her face, seeing the storm beneath her resolve. "Legacy's only useful if it doesn't blind you," he said, the words cutting clean, not cruel. Lillian exhaled sharply, as if she'd been holding a truth even from herself. "You sound like someone who's lost something." "I have," he said, his voice steady but heavy with memory. "But not everything." Later that day, Lillian stood on the back porch, watching Clara transform a stack of old cardboard boxes into a rocket base, her laughter ringing across the grass like forgotten bells rediscovered. "Hey, Rocket Commander," Lillian called, a smile breaking through her guarded exterior. Clara popped her head out, her curls a wild halo. "Commander Clara to base. Liftoff in T-minus 15 seconds." Lillian stepped into the yard, arms crossed, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "Permission to board?" Clara nodded with exaggerated seriousness. "Only if you believe in star wolves and secret wings." Lillian blinked, caught off guard. "Star wolves?" "It's a story I'm writing," Clara said, her voice brimming with pride. "About a wolf left behind who builds his own rocket. He's sad, but he's brave." Lillian knelt beside the box, her voice soft. "Does he ever get home?" Clara shrugged, her eyes bright with a wisdom beyond her years. "Maybe, but sometimes being brave is just choosing to launch anyway." The words hit Lillian like a quiet thunderclap, stirring something deep within her. She reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind Clara's ear. "Do you even know how much wisdom you carry?" "I'm 8, Clara grinned. "I carry snacks and secrets. Same thing." Lillian laughed, a real laugh, bright and unguarded, but her smile faded as a new thought took root. "Clara," she said, her voice softer, tentative, "if someone knew something big, something scary, but telling it might hurt people, what would you want them to do?" Clara considered, her small face serious. "I'd want them to be brave, like the Star Wolf, but only if they do it with love, not anger." Otherwise, it's just noise. Just noise. Lillian's gaze drifted back to the house, to the hard drive on the kitchen table, to everything she'd tried to bury and everything she could no longer ignore. That night, as Clara slept under a quilt stitched with stars and dog-eared paperbacks, Lillian stood by the kitchen window, dialing a number she hadn't touched in years. It rang 3 times, each chime a heartbeat in the dark. "Hello?" The voice was hoarse, startled, as if pulled from a memory. "It's me," Lillian said, her voice steady but urgent. "I don't have much time, but I need you to listen." A pause thick with caution. "You shouldn't be calling. They're looking." "I know," she replied, unflinching, "but I'm not hiding anymore." Another pause, heavier. "Is it true? The data. Does it go all the way up?" "All the way," she said, her voice a blade cutting through the silence. "Dirtier than I ever imagined, and swept cleaner than you'd believe." A long exhale crackled through the line. "What are you going to do?" Lillian glanced at Clara's room, the soft glow of a nightlight spilling under the door. "I'm going to do something with love, not noise." Then she hung up, the click of vow she couldn't unmake. The next morning, Evan found her by the front door, tying her boots with a grace born of resolve, her movements steady despite the storm in her eyes. "Going somewhere?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe, arms folded. "To a place that still believes in signal over static," she said, her voice clear, unwavering. "There's a community radio station, Echo 92.7 FM, just outside downtown. Used to be where whistleblowers read poetry when no one else would listen." Evan's brow furrowed, his voice low. "That's not exactly secure." "No," she admitted, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "But it's human. They still know the sound of truth when it hits the air." He handed her a folded piece of paper, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting moment. She opened it. Coordinates, a time, a rooftop. He nodded. "Signal booster. 10 minutes of uninterrupted feed. That's all I can promise." Lillian tucked the paper into her coat, her eyes searching his. "Why are you helping me?" Evan looked at her, his gaze steady, carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken choices. "Because my daughter thinks you have wings, and I've learned not to question her instincts." As Lillian opened the front door, Clara bounded down the stairs, pajamas askew, clutching a crumpled drawing. "Wait," she called, her voice bright with urgency. She handed Lillian the sketch. A star wolf, wings wide, scars visible, eyes fierce with determination. "I made a new version," Clara said. "This time, he's not flying alone." Lillian knelt, pulling Clara into a tight hug, her heart too full for words. "Neither am I," she whispered, her voice breaking. Then she stepped into the morning, the door closing softly behind her. But on the porch rail, a tiny red light blinked, watching, its gleam a silent thread in the dawn. The building crouched in obscurity, squeezed between a shuttered mechanic's garage and a laundromat where dryers hummed like restless ghosts. Echo 92.7 FM, the sign flickered above the door, its neon pulse weary, as if it had grown tired of calling out to a world that rarely listened. Lillian stood at the threshold, her hooded coat shielding her from the night, the black hard drive clutched in her hands like a living heart, heavy with secrets. This station, once a haven for late-night poets and weathered DJs, had been a refuge for voices with nowhere else to go. Tonight, it was her last stand. The old man at the booth looked up, startled, his eyes clouded with cataracts but sharp with recognition. "You're late," he growled, his voice rough as gravel. Lillian pulled back her hood, her face bare to the dim light. "Still take walk-ins?" He paused, then leaned back, a spark of understanding flickering in his gaze. "Voss," he muttered almost to himself, "didn't think you'd walk through that door again." "Neither did I," she said, her voice steady but laced with the weight of her choice. His eyes dropped to the hard drive, then back to her. "You've got something the world needs to hear." She nodded, her jaw tight. 10 minutes, no edits, no delays. He cracked his knuckles, a ritual of defiance, and flipped a switch. The on-air sign flared red, a beacon in the dark. "This station still listens," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "The world? Not always." The countdown began. 3 minutes to air. Lillian paced the cramped room, her hands trembling, not from fear but from the electric pulse of truth clawing its way out. Through the cracked window, the city murmured, distant sirens, a saxophone's mournful wail from a nearby stoop, a world oblivious to the storm about to break. The old DJ glanced at her. "Want me to do the intro?" She shook her head, her voice firm. "I'll speak my own name." Silence settled, heavy and expectant, until the red light burned steady. Lillian leaned into the microphone, her voice calm but alive, cutting through the air like dawn, splitting the night. "My name is Lillian Voss. Until last week, I was the CEO of NextEra, a company that promised to make the world think smarter, feel safer, live freer." She paused, letting the words hang, a confession and a challenge. We lied. The silence that followed crackled with electricity, a charged void waiting to be filled. "I hold a hard drive," she continued, her voice unwavering. "It contains data logs, memos, private communications, proof that NextEra's neural tech wasn't just for music playlists or shopping habits. It tracked, manipulated, and influenced decisions, political, personal, medical, without consent." A distant screech of tires pierced the night outside, sharp and ominous. Lillian pressed on, her voice steady, a blade slicing through the dark. "When I raised alarms, they removed me. Quietly, efficiently. Those who knew were bought or silenced." She took a breath, softer now, almost a whisper. "But tonight, I choose differently. I choose noise. I choose clarity. I choose to be a voice that doesn't whisper when shouting might save someone." The DJ stared, his eyes wide, caught in the raw power of her words. Lillian's voice trembled, not from fear, but from the release of a truth she'd carried too long. "I know this may cost me everything, but if there's a girl out there, like the one I met yesterday, who believes people can grow wings again, then maybe it's worth it." The red light blinked faster, a warning pulse. "To those listening, feeling powerless, remember this. The system thrives on your silence, your stillness. But the moment you move, the moment you speak, you become the disruption they fear." A sharp click cut the air. The mic went dead, not by her hand. The DJ's gaze snapped to the console, his voice a hoarse whisper. "They jammed us. We're off air." Lillian froze, her heart pounding. Outside, a black SUV roared up, its headlights slicing through the night like a guillotine. The DJ stood, urgency in his movements. "Back exit," he muttered, pressing a small cassette into her hand. "Backup copy. Take it. Run." Lillian clutched the tape, her boots pounding the tile as she bolted down the narrow hallway, the cold air of the alley hitting her lungs like a blade. Behind her, a voice echoed through the building. "She's gone. I repeat, she's not here." Followed by the crackle of radios and the thud of footsteps. But she was already a shadow, swallowed by the night. 20 minutes later, breathless and trembling, Lillian reached the rooftop coordinates Evan had given her. The old radio tower loomed against the star-strewn sky, its red light blinking like a heartbeat. Evan stood by a rusted control box, his hands deftly adjusting cables with a precision born of years in the shadows. She held up the cassette, her voice ragged. "They cut the station." He didn't flinch, his eyes steady, resolute. "Then we go higher." He plugged a cable into the transmitter, flipped 3 switches with practiced calm, and nodded. "One shot, 10 minutes of pure signal, like I promised." Lillian slid the cassette into the deck, her fingers trembling but sure. She took a deep breath, the weight of the moment anchoring her, and pressed play. Her voice spilled out again, unfiltered, unstoppable, pouring from windows, buses, and dented kitchen radios across the city. Evan stepped back, his gaze on the stars. "Think anyone's listening?" he asked, his voice soft but heavy with hope. Lillian didn't answer, her eyes glassy, fixed on the sky. "They have to be." The rooftop wind howled as if the night itself leaned in to hear, then a distant clatter, boots on metal steps rising from the alley below. Evan's eyes sharpened, his voice urgent. "Go." "I'm not leaving you," Lillian said, her voice fierce, rooted in a loyalty she hadn't known she possessed. He shook his head, his expression unyielding. You don't need to. He strode to the edge of the roof, yanking a cable from the junction box. Sparks erupted, the lights plunging into darkness. Below, the boots stopped. Their pursuit halted in the sudden blackout. In the silence, Lillian's voice continued to echo, a beacon cutting through a city grown too quiet for too long. Somewhere far away, Clara sat in her pajamas, drawing by flashlight, her father still not home. The radio on her nightstand crackled, then filled with a voice she knew. Strong, soft, brave. She smiled, her small hand pausing over her sketch of a star wolf. He made it, she whispered, and for the first time in a long time, the dark didn't scare her. The law office was a cramped sanctuary, smelling of old paper and bitter coffee, its air thick with the hum of an air purifier and the weight of secrets too dangerous to speak. No nameplate marked the door, no sign announced its purpose. Just a faded painting on the wall, a mountain cobbled from torn newspaper headlines, jagged and defiant. Evan sat beside Lillian, his eyes tracing the artwork's edges, a distraction from the tension coiling in his chest. Lillian's arms were crossed, the hard drive in her bag pulsing like a heartbeat she couldn't silence. The door creaked open, and a woman stepped in, her presence like a melody Evan hadn't heard in years. Familiar, unresolved, carrying the ache of old promises. It's been a long time, Evan said, his voice steady but laced with memory as he stood. Nora Blake, civil rights attorney, once an idealist, once more than that, now a necessary stranger, met his gaze. Her voice was soft, measured, like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. The one who still owes me 2 coffees and a conversation. Evan cleared his throat, deflecting the weight of her words. This isn't about us. No, Nora said, her eyes not leaving his, but it always comes down to what people are willing to risk. And for whom? She turned to Lillian, her gaze sharp, assessing. You have it. Lillian slid the bag across the table, her movements deliberate, her voice steady. Encrypted. 3 fail-safes. Tamper with it, and it fries itself. Nora Blake's eyes lingered on the hard drive, her fingers hovering but not touching, as if it might burn her with its secrets. Smart, she said, her voice a low hum of respect. But intelligence doesn't win this kind of war. Narrative does. Right now, yours is buried beneath headlines written by the people you're trying to expose. Lillian's gaze was steady, her voice calm but unyielding, a blade tempered by resolve. Truth doesn't need a publicist. Nora's dry chuckle cut through the tension, sharp but not unkind. No, but it needs a plan. Otherwise, it's just background noise. Evan leaned forward, his voice grounded, urgent. Then what's the plan? Nora's eyes flicked to him, then back to Lillian. We use the Freedom of Information Protocol. I know 2 senators who won't flinch, but you'll need to sign an affidavit verifying the chain of custody. Lillian's eyes narrowed, a spark of defiance flaring. You mean make it official that I'm the whistleblower? Yes, Nora said, her voice unflinching, her gaze steady. Best case, you're summoned before Congress. Worst case, you vanish between headlines. The room fell silent, the air heavy with the weight of choices too big to hold. Then Nora turned to Evan, her voice softening, almost kind, but carrying a warning. I'm not worried about her. I'm worried about you. Evan blinked, caught off guard. Me? You have a daughter, Nora said, her words precise, cutting through the haze. They'll go after what makes you hesitate. Lillian leaned in, her voice low, urgent. Don't. But Nora pressed on, her tone gentle yet relentless. You think you're protecting Clara by staying out of the storm, Evan? The quiet ones get erased first because no one notices. His jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with a fire he'd buried long ago. You think I don't know that? I think you're a good man, Nora said, her voice steady, almost tender. And good men get used, or worse, convinced to stay silent for their children's sake. Then those children grow up thinking silence is noble. Lillian's gaze darted to Evan, her voice barely above a whisper, raw with guilt. You don't owe me anything. If you want to walk away, I understand. Evan stared at the table, the faded painting on the wall blurring in his vision, a mountain of torn headlines, a monument to truths untold. Then he spoke, his voice steady, resolute, like a man who'd found his footing on a crumbling ledge. When Clara was 5, she asked why the moon followed us home. I told her it's because light remembers who looks up at it. He looked at both women now, his eyes fierce with conviction. I won't teach her to look down. Lillian exhaled slowly, her chest loosening, as if his words had untied a knot she hadn't known was there. Nora didn't smile, but her shoulders softened, a quiet acknowledgement of his resolve. You're both going to need protection, she said, and courage. Evan stood, his presence a quiet anchor. We've got one. We'll figure out the other. They stepped out into the dusk, the city humming with a nervous energy, as if it sensed the fault lines shifting beneath its surface. Lillian walked slightly ahead, her steps lighter, less guarded, as if shedding a weight she'd carried too long. That woman, she said without turning, her voice soft but curious. You used to love her. Evan's gaze lifted to the sky, where the moon hid behind a veil of clouds, but the stars blinked awake, defiant. Yes, he said, his voice steady but heavy with memory. Before we both learned how many things love can't fix. Lillian nodded, her silence a shared understanding. Then quieter. Did it hurt? He paused, the stars reflecting in his eyes. Only when I thought silence was safer than telling her the truth. She stopped walking, her breath catching, his words a mirror to her own fears. What's different now? Evan turned to her, his eyes quiet but fierce, burning with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. Now I've got something worth saying. Lillian held his gaze, not with pity or awe, but with recognition, a spark of shared defiance. She reached into her coat, pulling out a folded piece of paper, its edges worn from countless touches. A message, she said, her voice low. From the man who warned me before I ran. Evan unfolded it, the crooked handwriting stark against the page. They'll erase your name before your voice. Speak anyway. He looked back at her, his jaw tight. You ready? Lillian's half-smile was a flicker of courage, fragile but fierce. I was never built for quiet. Their shadows stretched long into the night, trailing behind them as a news site refreshed with a breaking headline. Former NextEra CEO and alleged whistleblower, spotted with activist attorney. The grainy photo captured Evan, unmistakable, a child's drawing tucked in his coat pocket, a quiet rebellion against a world that thrived on silence. The house creaked, not from age but from silence folding in on itself, a weight that pressed against the walls. Past midnight, Clara slept soundly, curled under a blanket with a book splayed open on her chest, its pages dreaming of stars. Lillian had taken the guest room, but the faint glow of her screen seeped under the door, a restless light betraying her sleeplessness. Evan stood in the kitchen, staring at the cordless phone on the counter. Not his cell, but the landline, its silence more menacing than any sound. It had rung once, then stopped. A second time, shorter. A third, and when he answered, there was only static. Deliberate, heavy, like someone waiting to be heard. Then a voice, metallic and cold, slithered through. Keep going, and your daughter won't just lose a father. She'll lose her name, her school, her hospital file, her future. She'll become no one, and no one saves no one. Click, no caller ID, no trace. Just the hum of the fridge and the air turning solid in Evan's chest. He didn't move, didn't call out, just sat at the table in the dark, the weight of the threat settling like dust in his lungs. Time blurred, but he felt the moment Clara padded into the kitchen, half asleep, rubbing her eyes, her small frame a beacon in the shadows. Daddy? Her voice was soft, but the room seemed to lean in to listen. He forced a smile, his heart steadying at the sight of her. Couldn't sleep? She shook her head and climbed into his lap, as she had when the world was simpler, when monsters stayed under the bed. Was Mommy like Lillian? She asked, her voice drowsy but curious. Smart and quiet and strong? Evan wrapped his arms around her, his voice soft, carrying the weight of memory. No, Bug, Mommy was louder, but she believed in quiet people. Clara rested her head against his chest, her breathing slow, trusting. After a long pause, she whispered, Are we going to be okay? He didn't answer right away, his gaze drifting to the window, where stars gleamed without a moon to guide them. "Yes," he said finally, his voice a vow. "We're going to be okay." She looked up, her eyes wide, searching. "Even if they don't like what you say?" "Especially then," he said, brushing a curl from her face. "Because silence isn't always safe, and some words are worth the risk." Clara blinked slowly, her small hand tightening around his. "Like what?" "Like I love you. I believe you. I'm here." She nodded, a sleepy smile breaking through. "I like those ones." He kissed her forehead, his heart aching with love too big for words. "Then I'll keep saying them." She yawned, her voice fading. "Even if it's scary?" He looked out at the night, the stars steady in their quiet rebellion. "Especially if it's scary." The next morning, the house was quieter than usual. Not peaceful, but loaded, like a held breath waiting to break. Lillian sat at the breakfast table, scrolling through news feeds on a borrowed tablet, her coffee cold, her jaw tight with resolve. Evan entered, holding Clara's lunchbox, his face etched with a father's quiet pride. "She's ready for school," he said. Tried to wear two different shoes, called it distraction fashion. Lillian cracked a small smile, the tension in her shoulders easing. "She's braver than I am." He sat across from her, his voice low, steady. "They called." Her eyes darkened, her hand tightening around her mug. "Who?" "The ones who don't leave fingerprints." "What did they say?" Evan's voice didn't waver, though his heart did. "They threatened Clara, her records, her identity." "I'm so sorry," Lillian whispered, her voice trembling with guilt, her hand tightening around the mug as if it could anchor her to the moment. Evan cut her off, his voice firm but not harsh, a steady hand in the storm. Don't be sorry for what they do." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy, thick with the weight of choices that could unravel lives. He leaned forward, his eyes steady, holding hers. "I didn't tell Clara the details, but she asked if I was scared." Lillian's gaze softened, searching his face. "And?" "I told her the truth," he said, his voice low, resolute. "That I was. But I won't let fear decide for me." She held his gaze, her breath catching, her eyes glistening with a vulnerability she hadn't shown before. "You told her that?" "Yes," he said, his voice unwavering. "And maybe this isn't just about my kid anymore." A pause hung between them, fragile but electric. Lillian reached into her jacket, her fingers trembling as she placed the hard drive on the table, its scratched surface gleaming with the word Veritas. "I've made the final decryption keys," she said, her voice steady now, a vow forged in fire. "After this, there's no ambiguity. Everything I know goes public." Evan nodded, his eyes searching hers. "You sure?" She didn't hesitate, her voice cutting through the quiet. "I'm tired of whispering into rooms that won't echo." That afternoon, as Clara climbed onto the school bus, waving from the window with a grin that lit up the gray day, Evan stood on the porch, Lillian beside him. The wind carried a faint chill, a warning or a promise. "She okay?" Lillian asked, her voice soft, her eyes fixed on the bus. "She's better than okay," Evan said, his voice warm with pride. "She's watching how we choose. That's how kids learn." Lillian's gaze followed the bus as it rounded the corner, disappearing into the city's hum. "She'll remember this?" "Not the details," Evan said, his voice steady but heavy, "but the silence, or the lack of it. That stays." They stood there, the wind brushing past, carrying the weight of what was to come. Evan turned to her, his eyes resolute. "Let's finish this." Lillian didn't smile, but her eyes were clear, bright with a courage she'd thought she'd lost. "Yeah," she said. "Let's speak where it matters." By the end of the week, Evan's house no longer felt like a sanctuary. It was a target, marked by unseen eyes. The first sign came before dawn, a faint hum slicing through the quiet. A gray drone, not the kind kids flew in parks, hovering outside Clara's bedroom window, its cold gaze sending a shiver down Evan's spine. The second was a news segment at 7:03 a.m., a breaking report titled "Ex-Engineer Turned Radical." Inside the disinformation cell, hiding Lillian Voss, the screen flashed a grainy photo of Evan stepping through his front door, Lillian just behind him, her face half hidden by a scarf. The narration painted them as tech extremists, a threat to national interests, a label Evan never imagined would cling to his name. "They're not even trying to hide it," Lillian muttered, her voice raw, staring at the TV. Evan didn't respond. He flicked it off, the silence louder than the accusations. Outside, the word traitor had been keyed into his truck's side, its jagged letters a wound in the metal. Clara saw it first, clutching her backpack, her voice small but steady. "Daddy, does that mean you betrayed someone?" Evan knelt, meeting her eyes, his heart aching, but his voice calm. "It means someone's afraid of the truth, Bug. And when people are afraid, they throw words like knives." Clara nodded, not fully understanding, but trusting enough to keep her chin high. "Should I not go to school today?" she whispered. Evan glanced at the empty bus stop, dust swirling in the wind. He swallowed hard, his jaw tight. "I'll drive you." That night, Lillian sat alone in the small room where Clara practiced piano, the air heavy with the scent of polished wood and forgotten melodies. Her hands hovered over the keys, hesitant, as if afraid to disturb the silence. Her eyes fell on a small USB recorder, a thrift store find Clara used to capture her mother's song. Lillian pressed play, almost by instinct. At first it was soft, hesitant notes, stumbles, Clara's giggles, but then voices, hers and another. "You're asking me to destroy this," her recorded voice said, sharp with defiance. A colder voice answered, calculated, familiar. "You built it, you signed it. Now walk away." "You're asking me to disappear," she'd said. "I'm asking you to be loyal." Click. Lillian's hand froze, her breath catching. It was weeks old the night before she ran, captured by accident when Clara left the recorder on. The legal counsel from Nexthera's board, his words a veiled threat to vanish or be erased. She stood, heart pounding, and ran to the living room. "Evan," she said breathless, "we have something better than the hard drive." The next morning, they uploaded the audio to an encrypted site, layered with verification protocols. Lillian sent the link to one person, Sofia Delgado, an independent journalist who'd survived smear campaigns with her integrity intact. Then they waited. 2 hours. 4. 6. At 3:22 p.m., it broke. Sofia's post went live, captioned simply, "When the ones who built the system are told to disappear, ask who's holding the broom." The audio played, raw, human, unfiltered. Within 20 minutes, it had 400,000 views. Within an hour, Nexthera's stock plummeted 8%. But it wasn't the numbers that tightened Evan's chest. It was Clara, bursting through the door, dropping her backpack. "Daddy, I heard my recording on the bus." He crouched, his heart swelling. "Did it scare you?" "No," she said, her eyes bright with pride. "They said it was the bravest thing a kid ever did by accident." Evan smiled through the sting in his eyes, his voice soft. "Sometimes the truth needs a little accident." But by nightfall, the threats escalated. Their internet cut out, a digital blackout. The house phone rang every 15 minutes, each unanswered call a silent menace. Cars parked across the street, their engines idling, occupants unseen. Lillian paced by the window, her voice a whisper. "We're not safe here anymore." Evan's gaze fell on Clara, asleep on the couch, her head nestled against a stuffed animal missing one ear. "I won't move her again," he said quietly, his voice unyielding. "Not unless we have to." Lillian turned, her eyes heavy with guilt. "You've done enough. This shouldn't be your fight." He met her gaze, his voice steady, fierce. It became mine the moment Clara's voice saved more than a song. She blinked, her breath catching, searching for words that wouldn't come. "What do we do now?" Evan looked at the USB recorder on the table, its small light a beacon in the dark. "We wait for the noise to grow. Then we speak under it." Lillian tilted her head, a question in her eyes. "Below the noise?" He nodded, his voice a quiet vow. "Where truth still echoes." Outside, the sky burned purple with dusk, the house flickering with small lights, quiet breaths, and a faith not in victory, but in standing firm. Not because they were heroes, but because someone had to hold the line until the lies crumbled. The storm came not with thunder, but with silence. Nexthera's statement hit the airwaves. a fabricated audio file designed to manipulate public sentiment. We are investigating its origin. They didn't deny the voice, only its source. Evan stood in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, the TV's glow casting shadows across his face. The sun hadn't risen, but the damage had. Lillian entered, a folded newspaper in hand, her voice low. "They're offering me a deal." He looked up, his eyes steady. "Publicly recant? Blame it on a mental breakdown," she said, her tone bitter. "Say I fabricated the audio to sabotage the board. In return, no jail. A clean break. Exile somewhere offshore." Evan took a long sip, his voice calm but cutting. "And the truth?" Lillian's smile was sharp, tinged with resolve. "It gets buried. Again. In a nicer grave." Evan sat on the cold concrete floor of the garage, surrounded by relics of a life half forgotten. Old engineering books, their pages yellowed with time, a broken telescope, its lens clouded but still dreaming of stars, and a faded photograph of Amelia, smiling wide on the hood of their rusted Subaru, her laughter frozen in sunlight. He held the photo, his fingers tracing its worn edges, as if he could summon her back through sheer will. Lillian stood in the doorway, her silhouette soft against the dim light, watching him with a quiet reverence. "She was beautiful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, carrying a tenderness she rarely allowed. "Yeah," Evan replied, his voice thick with memory, "and stubborn as hell." Lillian's lips curved into a faint smile, warmed by the echo of a woman she'd never met. "She once told me," Evan continued, his gaze still on the photo, "your legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you protect while you're still breathing." Lillian knelt beside him, her eyes searching his, her voice soft but piercing. "And what are you still protecting, Evan?" He looked at her, really looked, his eyes steady, fierce with a truth he'd carried too long. "You." 2 days later, Lillian vanished from the public eye. No press release, no grainy airport footage, no whispered goodbyes. One moment, she was the eye of the storm, a name on every headline. The next, she was a ghost, gone without a trace. The world assumed she'd taken next era's deal, trading truth for exile. Evan let them believe it, his silence a shield for her new beginning. In a small town 3 states away, nestled by a forgotten lake where the water shimmered like glass under moonlight, Lillian Voss became Emma Hayes. She taught math at a community center, her voice steady as she guided children through equations, her cell phone forsaken, her Saturdays spent baking muffins for kids who knew her only as the quiet woman with kind eyes. Evan and Clara visited once a month, never staying overnight, never taking the same route twice. Each time, Clara ran to her, arms wide like a niece to her favorite aunt, and when they left, Emma stood on the porch, a solitary figure behind a screen door, waving as if her past had dissolved into the lake's still waters. Evan, meanwhile, took a consulting job at a small ethics and tech nonprofit, unassuming work that suited him. He wore denim to meetings, sipped burnt coffee, and spoke at 2 local high schools about digital responsibility, his words plain but heavy with conviction. A student once asked, her voice curious, "Do you ever miss the spotlight?" He paused, his eyes drifting to the window, where the sky stretched wide and unyielding. "No," he said, his voice steady. "The spotlight's loud. Truth prefers the corners." One evening, Evan and Clara sat at the kitchen table, cutting vegetables for soup, the air rich with the scent of onions and thyme. Clara hummed softly, the same melody Lillian had once played on their dusty piano, a thread connecting past to present. "Dad," she said, not looking up, her knife moving with careful precision, "do you think they'll ever say she was right?" Evan set down his knife, wiping his hands on a dish towel, his movements slow, deliberate. "Maybe not, Bug," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But here's the thing. Truth doesn't ask to be recognized. It just asks not to be forgotten." Clara looked at him, her eyes bright with a wisdom too big for her years. "Is that why we still visit her?" He nodded, his heart swelling with quiet pride. She protected something while she was still breathing. Clara's lips curved into a faint smile, her hands pausing over the carrots. So did you. That night, Evan pulled a small frame from a drawer, its edges worn but sturdy. Inside was a single sheet of handwritten music, the melody Lillian had taught Clara, the one Amelia had composed before the world took her away. At the bottom, in Lillian's careful script, were words that felt like a vow. Don't let your voice disappear beneath the noise. Sing, even when no one listens. He hung it above the piano, no ceremony, just a quiet promise stitching together the past and what came after. Snow fell early that year, spiraling softly outside the windows, dusting the porch railings and the pines beyond in a delicate shroud. Inside, the fireplace crackled, casting shadows that danced across the floorboards like memories set free. Clara sat cross-legged on the living room rug, her notebook open, her pencil moving in short, deliberate strokes. Her drawing was nearly complete, a piano with wings, soaring through a sky of stars, its keys gleaming with quiet defiance. Evan watched from the couch, a cup of tea in his hands, steam curling past his face like whispers of a life settled into place, a stone finding its rest in the riverbed. "Hey, Dad?" Clara asked, still sketching, her voice soft but clear. "Yeah, sweetheart." She looked up, her eyes thoughtful, searching. "The things Miss Emma told you back then, do you think all of it was true?" Evan took a long breath, setting his cup down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I don't know," he said, his voice honest, unguarded. "I think some of it was. Maybe not every fact, but the why behind it. That felt true." Clara tilted her head, her pencil pausing. "So does that mean what you did was right?" He smiled, gentle but not certain, his heart steady in its quiet conviction. "I think so. Not because it was easy or even smart, but because it's what I'd want you to do if you ever had to choose between comfort and conscience." Lillian fell silent, her eyes tracing Clara's drawing, the weight of the moment settling like dust in her chest. Then she nodded, a quiet gesture carrying a truth too vast for words. Evan followed her gaze to the sketch, a piano with wings, soaring through a star-strewn sky. "Wings on a piano?" he asked, a small laugh breaking through, warm and grounding, like the crackle of a hearth. Clara grinned, her eyes sparkling with the kind of imagination that could reshape the world. "It's flying out of a building, like in those old spy movies. But instead of exploding, it plays a song that makes people stop lying." Evan's laugh was deep, the kind that felt like home, a sound that wrapped around the heart and held tight. "I hope you never lose that imagination," he said, his voice thick with pride and something softer. "Hope." Clara looked down, her pencil hovering over a blank page, hesitation flickering in her small frame. "Can I ask one more thing?" "Anything," Evan said, his eyes steady, open. She glanced up, her voice soft but piercing. "Do you think Miss Emma ever missed the world she left behind?" Evan paused, his thoughts drifting to the woman who'd become a shadow, now teaching math by a quiet lake. "I think," he said slowly, his voice measured, "she missed the idea of it, the version she once believed in. But I also think she found something better." Clara tilted her head, curious. "Like what?" He stood, crossing to the mantel, where a small frame rested, its edges worn but resolute. Inside was a sheet of handwritten music, Amelia's melody, penned by Lillian's careful hand. He handed it to Clara. "You," he said, his voice a quiet vow. "She found you, and maybe in some way, we gave her a place where her voice didn't have to fight so hard to be heard." Clara held the frame close, as if it were more than ink and paper, her small fingers tracing the notes. "She wrote something on the bottom," she said, reading aloud, her voice clear and steady. "Don't let your voice disappear beneath the noise. Sing, even when no one listens." She looked up, her eyes wide with wonder. "Is that what we're doing now? Still singing?" Evan didn't answer with words. He crossed to the old upright piano, its wood scarred but warm, and lifted the lid. His fingers found the first notes of Amelia's melody, tentative at first, then sure. Clara joined him, her smaller hands echoing the tune, their notes weaving together, imperfect but full, filling the house with a sound that didn't demand applause or an audience. It was enough to resonate in the space between father and daughter, a quiet defiance against a world that thrived on silence. Weeks later, a letter arrived, its envelope plain. No return address, just a single page folded twice. Clara read it aloud, her voice bright against the morning's quiet. The air is colder here, but the silence is kind. I planted tomatoes last week. They're stubborn, but so am I. Thank you for giving me back a life no algorithm could predict. E. She tucked the letter into her notebook beside the drawing of the winged piano and smiled. She's still writing. Always, Evan nodded, his voice warm with a quiet pride. Some people leave footprints. She leaves ink. That spring, Evan was invited to speak at a university ethics panel. He wore a borrowed blazer, its fit slightly off, and brought no slides, only a story, not of betrayal or corporate schemes, but of choice. Standing before the students, his voice steady, he said, "The world will always ask you to lower your voice, to blend in, to settle. But the ones who leave something behind, they're the ones who stand still long enough to hear what matters most." A student raised her hand, her voice curious but earnest. "Do you think one person really makes a difference?" Evan's gaze drifted to the back row, where Clara sat, swinging her legs, her sketchbook open in her lap. "Yes," he said, his voice firm, carrying the weight of 1,000 quiet battles. "Because the difference isn't always in what changes the world, but in what doesn't change in you." Back home, Evan and Clara hung the speech transcript beside the piano, beneath Amelia's music sheet, two voices woven into one melody. On a quiet summer evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and fireflies blinked like slow applause, Clara asked one final question, her voice soft but clear. "Dad, are we the good guys?" Evan looked at her, at the child who gave wings to broken songs, who believed when adults faltered, and his voice, low and steady, carried a truth deeper than certainty. "We tried to be, Bug. And maybe that's the loudest truth we'll ever tell. Below the noise, where courage lives, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet choice to stand for what's right, even when no one's watching."